Hi everyone, thank you very much for having me today at your meeting. I first of all wanted to thank Elizabeth Fraser and the Queensland Children's Commissioner for having me join today. Today I wanted to share with you some reflections on our NGO pre-sessional with the Committee on the Rights of the Child last October. And to do that I wanted to take you back to December 2010 when as a children's sector we had representatives like Pam Simmons and lots of different children's organisations and youth advocates themselves come around a table and think about how we're going to frame the state of children's rights, interests and well-being to this committee who doesn't necessarily have a great understanding of the children's context in Australia. And so the message that we came up with, the frame that we wanted to promote, was simply the words, listen to children. Because really, if you think about those words in listening to children, that is our area of greatest need and our area of greatest potential. Because it is by listening to children that we enable a greater sense of dignity and worth in every child. And so for us, as we were preparing our Listen to Children report, an alternative report that will shadow the government's report that really outlines what the state of children's wellbeing is, we said that actually 5 years from now when we next report, we want listening to children to have been the measure by which we see our success. In listening to children, we actually want to, 5 years from now, have a much greater successful story to say to the committee when we're next there. We all know the power of listening to kids. I saw this firsthand when I was 2009 youth representative, where I went through 6 different juvenile detention centres and 4 homeless shelters, meeting 51 children and young people that at different times in their life had been deprived of their liberty. And for a lot of them, they would tell me that the difference between, from having been listened to and not listened to, was the difference actually between powerlessness and empowerment. And I thought I'd share with you one story in particular, a girl who I will call Charlotte, a 17-year-old girl who I met in a homeless shelter. As I walked in the door, I sat down with about 5 young people. We talked about stories, we talked about the shelter and their lives, just with pizza. And this girl, throughout the whole session, would not say anything. You could look at Charlotte and you could tell straight away that hers was the face of a broken spirit. You could tell that this girl had gone through great trauma. And at the end of our meeting, I put some A3 pieces of paper on the table and I said, if anyone would like to, you can add your story, write down a message, write down a letter of recommendation, anything you'd like to say to politicians in Australia. And interestingly, Charlotte grabbed this piece of paper and she returned to me 45 minutes later and said simply, tell my story. This letter, a full-page letter, conveyed a tragic story of abuse that had started at the age of 6 by her grandfather. Now, unfortunately, when little Charlotte had tried to go for her dad and her family for help, they believed her grandfather's story over hers. And what proceeded from that moment when Charlotte was not able to heal, when she wasn't listened to, when her cries for help fell on deaf ears, Charlotte then entered adolescence in this state where she kept having this cycle of discouragement, where she kept trying to numb her sense of homelessness through a cycle of alcohol, drugs and abuse. Now, when her family broke up, when her mum remarried a violent man, Charlotte's life got worse. And I met her when in recent years she'd just been going from homeless shelter to homeless shelter. Now, when I think of the power of listening to children and what that actually means, I think of kids like Charlotte. Because reports like Listen to Children and trips to Geneva to meet with a committee, they're just a means to an end. The end point is actually where every single community in Australia puts children and their wellbeing first, and where every single child within those communities actually has an opportunity to enjoy the full complement of their rights. Now, our work in putting this report together was not just about 54 pages of words. It was actually about spreading awareness within the community. And we started that work by having a parliamentary launch in Canberra, which was attended by Alistair Roy from the ACT. We also took that work to Victoria, where we partnered with Bernie Geary's office, and to WA, where we worked with Michelle Scott's office. All this work was about celebrating, upholding what has been working with children's rights and wellbeing in the country, but also focusing on our priorities. And in the report, we said those 4 priorities were, firstly, children in out-of-home care. The disgraceful increase in the amount of children in care to the point where we have 35,000 kids in care in the country, where it's increased by 51% since 2005. And also the amount of children who are Indigenous in juvenile detention, to the point where an Indigenous young person is 28 times more likely to be imprisoned in a juvenile detention centre than a non-Indigenous young person. We all talked about the rights of kids with disabilities in education, and we talked about all the frightening unknowns we have about the state of kids, of migrant children in asylum seeker detention centres. Now, when we talk these messages to the committee, what was probably the most telling and inspiring thing was that a lot of our talking and a lot of our presentations was youth-led. We had 2 Indigenous young girls who were the ones leading the technical reporting on the state of Indigenous kids in Australia. And we had a wonderful girl, Crystal Bartlett, who's worked with Bernie Geary and worked on the Charter for Children in out-of-home care in Victoria, who talked about the inspiring stories of kids in care, of how kids in care supporting each other and working out successful transitions from care. What was probably most obvious to say of the frustrations of the committee was their just complete bafflement with why things like homelessness are so high in Australia, despite the wealthy country that we come from. And also the reason why the state of Indigenous kids is still so far behind, yet there was this very famous apology given in 2007. And they were very baffled by the reason why we have this third country processing strategy for migrant children being mooted, when they looked at how developed and wealthy our country was. I think for me, the takeaway from what the committee was talking about was really the need for greater child rights education in the community, and how we need to look at each of our states and territories and take grip of what the familiar narratives, concepts and language are within those communities as a base for children's rights education. It's not enough to just declare that kids have rights. We need to grab familiar concepts and be clever in our delivery so that people can actually understand rights in a language that's friendly to them. And if we take grip of those familiar concepts, that's how we can broaden people's understanding of what children's rights is about. The convention is not just words on a page. The convention is actually a marker by which we can measure our progress in working with kids. And it's also our source of inspiration to continue to go further. I'm giving you this message just after the government having announced that it wants to establish a National Children's Commissioner this year. And I think that is an incredible, exciting move that the government has made. And that's a result of a lot of NGOs and a lot of advocates like yourselves having spent years in dedicating your lives to the cause of children in this country. I think it will be that National Children's Commissioner that will give greater profile to the common threads in your work and also complement your respective and individual mandates. I know that this is a great year for kids' wellbeing, with a report happening with the committee, and also from my own personal experience working as a youth participation advisor in World Vision's Indigenous Programs team, I'm seeing incredible stuff happening with kids in Indigenous communities. I know that we can actually have a country where every single community puts kids first, and I look forward to hearing the outcomes from your meeting. Thank you.